Hello, everybody. This is Fernando for the latest Ghosts and Spirits video. Well, I thought I would dust off the book that I last paused when it comes to the world of ghosts and spirits. This one titled The World's Greatest Ghost by Roger Bohr. Last time I had paused things, it was over on chapter 6, part 4, involving the world of ghosts and royals and rulers. So I'm going to go ahead and continue this chapter here and then do another part and then maybe a couple more parts before the chapter finishes altogether. But very interesting stuff, at least with regards to this universe of royals and rulers. We already saw some notable examples associated with royalty and how they continue to haunt their world even after they leave. In this case, we were talking about the Duke of Wellington. And so I'm going to continue this part here, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions, and I'd love to hear what you think as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's start with part 5, once again involving ghosts of royals and rulers. And then here's what it says. A ghost also changed the mind of an army leader during the Civil War. The Duke of Newcastle had occupied Bowling Hall at Bradford, Yorkshire, on behalf of the king, and ordered that everyone in the parliamentary stronghold be executed at dawn next day. His soldiers were puzzled when he withdrew the order shortly before they were due to carry it out. They learned that a female figure in white had appeared by their leader's bed 3 times in the night, wringing her hands and pleading, "Pity poor Bradford." 40 years after the war, England was again in the grip of internecine fighting. The Duke of Monmouth led a rebellion against James II, but his West Country army was crushed in the last battle fought on English soil at Sedgemoor, Somerset on July 6, 1685. The ghosts of some of the 1,000 men slaughtered had since been seen at the site of their deaths, and a phantom cavalry horseman is said to be the Duke himself. He escaped capture at the battle, but was beheaded 9 days later. A cruel sequel to the bloodshed was witnessed by a group of schoolchildren walking up Marple's Hill near Honington, Devon in 1904. They saw a wild looking man in a black wide brimmed hat and a long brown coat. His dazed look troubled the children, though their teachers saw nothing. Research showed that the bedraggled ghost may have been that of a man who had escaped the carnage at Sedgemoor and then made his way back to his wife and children who lived in a cottage there on the hill. As he neared his front door, a troop of soldiers rode up and then cut him down with their swords. Monmouth supporters who survived the fighting were tried by Judge George Jeffreys in a series of cases which became known as the Bloody Assizes. Slavery, transportation, flogging, and execution were the sentences he meted out in a legal reign of terror. Since then, his ghost, complete with a black cap used to deliver death sentences, has been seen in the rooms where he stayed during his West Country tour of duty. At Clouds Hotel in Shard, at Tewston Castle, at the Great House, at Lyme Regis, and then finally at Lyford Castle. The American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, has also left phantom reminders for future generations. One of the most horrific battles was at Shiloh, where 20,000 men died. The next day, locals reported that a nearby river ran red with blood, and the sights and sounds of the battle have been reenacted in the skies over the battlefield. Wars between nations have also left their mark on the supernatural world. The eerie footsteps of marching knights in armor have been heard at the historic English West Country site of Glastonbury, and headless war horses have been seen galloping through a Wiltshire valley through Woodmanton, the scene of an ancient battle between the Britons and the invading Romans. In 1745, more than 30 Cumbrians watched a phantom army march through the sky above Sauterfell at the time of the Jacobite Rebellion, and ghostly soldiers have been spotted at the site of the 1746 Battle of Culloden in Scotland. During World War I, soldiers from both the German and Allied armies told tales of supernatural intervention in the fighting of August 26, 1914. The British Expeditionary Force had taken a battering and looked like being overrun by the Kaiser's troops. Then the so called Angels of Mons appeared, causing consternation in the German trenches. The British had time to retreat and regroup. Author Arthur Machen, who wrote a story for the London Evening News, described the angels as phantom bowmen from the 1415 Battle of Agincourt, but he later claimed that he had made the whole thing up. The paper was deluged with letters from officers and men saying they had seen the specters. An officer from Bristol told his story in a local church parish magazine. He said his company had been cut off by German cavalry and he expected certain death. Then the angels appeared between the two forces, and the German horses were terrified into flight. A brigadier general and two of his officers told the same story to their chaplain, and a lieutenant colonel claimed that during the retreat, phantom horsemen guarded his cavalry battalion for 20 minutes, escorting their flanks in fields by the road. After the war, it was learned that both German and French troops involved in the Mons bloodshed had seen unearthly allies helping the British. Cynics argued that the three armies were exhausted by heavy fighting and could have been hallucinating. By then, the Angels of Mons had served their purpose. Morale in the British trenches after the battle was sky high. On August 4th, 1951, two English women on holiday in the French town of Dieppe awoke under the sound of gunfire. For 3 hours, they made a note of every sound, and experts who examined their record found it a carbon copy of what had happened on August 19th, 1942, when more than half of 6,000 stronghold of Anglo-Canadian force was wiped out trying to storm the German-held Normandy port there in a dawn raid. The women had asked fellow guests at their hotels about the sounds, but no one else had heard a thing. And then there's a mini segment called Legions of the Lost, which says in 1887, a British officer took a holiday in the Thuringian forest in what is now East Germany and saw a Roman legion march past him as he sat by the roadside. He found later that he was on the site of a battle between the Romans and a German tribe 2,000 years earlier. And then there's another little mini segment said, Skeptics beware. Here's what it says. If you don't believe in ghosts, keep the opinion to yourself when you visit the King's Arms Inn at Monkton Farleigh, Somerset. In 1974, one of the customers poured scorn on the idea of such things, and his words were followed by a loud crash upstairs and then a flood of water through the ceiling. A heavy freezer being defrosted had been pushed forward on its face. On another occasion, a tray of steaks was thrown across the room after doubts about ghosts were expressed. The pub also has several inexplicable sounds. Several people have heard an old woman talking to children in one room, and the manager, Eric Musprat, heard heavy boots walking along an upstairs corridor in the early hours, and several regulars had heard the flapping wings of a large bird in the bar. Each time, the room has suddenly become ice cold. Next segment is called Hail to the Dead Chief. Shawnee Curse puts paid to presidents. Here's what it says. Abraham Lincoln is still in the White House in Washington, but he is far from alive and well. For the president who led the United States out of the bitter Civil War, only to be assassinated by a fanatic on April 19 of 1865, now haunts the corridors of power as a ghost. American leaders and other celebrated visitors all claim to have seen him or felt his presence over the last 100 years. Sir Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime prime minister, did not enjoy sleeping in Lincoln's old bedroom and frequently moved to another room across the hall during the night. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands is said to have fainted after answering a door on the Rose Room door to find Lincoln standing outside. And then President Theodore Roosevelt once said, I see Lincoln, shambling homely with a sad, strong, deeply furrowed face in different rooms and halls. It was in 1934, during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, that Lincoln made his most dramatic appearance. Mary Eben, one of the White House staff, entered a bedroom on the second floor to find a figure in an old-fashioned black coat sitting on the bed and pulling on a pair of boots. She stared stunned at the man for several seconds before he vanished. More than 40 years earlier, another White House aide made a public appeal to Lincoln's ghost to leave him alone. John Kennedy was personal bodyguard to President Benjamin Harrison between 1889 and 1893, and his nerves were frayed by footsteps in corridors and rapping on doors which seemed to have no natural explanation. On a visit to Baltimore, he attended a seance at which Lincoln's spirit was present. Kennedy is said to have said, "Please don't do it again, Mr. Lincoln. I'm guarding the life of President Harrison now, and you've got me so scared I can't do my duty." Kennedy never heard the ghost again. Lincoln is said to step up his visits to his old offices in times of crisis. The chief White House usher saw him several times during World War II, and one of Theodore Roosevelt's valets fled, shrieking from the building. President Eisenhower said he sensed Lincoln's presence many times. Even while Lincoln was alive in the White House as the 16th President of the United States, there were also ghosts there. His wife, a confirmed spiritualist, saw her brother Alexander after he was killed while fighting on the Confederate side in the Civil War. Lincoln himself had a vision of his own death. He told an aide shortly before his assassination that he had been woken by quiet sobbing. He said, "I wandered downstairs until I came to the East Room. Before me was a catafalque with a corpse whose face was covered. 'Who is dead?' I demanded of the mourners, and they said, 'The President.' That was their reply. He was killed by an assassin." Franklin Roosevelt's death in 1945 came in chilling circumstances, and many laid at the door of an ancient Shawnee curse. What is known as the Indians' Revenge started nearly 180 years ago, when Shawnee chief Tecumseh died in a pitched battle with William Harrison, then governor of Indiana. In revenge, the Shawnee placed a curse on Harrison. Medicine men told how the governor would become president in a year ending in zero, but would then die in office. From then on, any president elected in a year, divisible by 20, would also die before his term ended. Harrison, grandfather of Benjamin, was duly elected president in 1840, and he died a month after taking office. Abe Lincoln was elected 20 years later and then was assassinated. The deaths of 5 other presidents have also been attributed to the Shawnee curse. James Garfield was elected to office in 1880 and was assassinated in 1881. William McKinley was re-elected in 1900 and then was assassinated in 1901. Warren Harding was elected in 1920 but died of a stroke in 1923. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1940 but died in 1945, and John Kennedy was elected in 1960 and was assassinated in 1963. And then there's a mini segment that's called The Ghost Train. Here's what it says. President Abraham Lincoln was shot dead in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth in a Washington theater. His coffin was carried on a special funeral train which stopped for 8 minutes at each station along the route so people could pay their respects. Soon afterwards, there were reports of a phantom train. It was draped in black and bore the president's coffin. One carriage carried a band of skeletal musicians. As the ghostly train passed along the funeral route, clocks stopped for exactly 8 minutes. And the last mini segment is called Stairway to Terror. It says, the quick tempers of successive owners of a mansion in Sutton, Surrey produced 2 ghosts on its staircase. In 1713, a messenger from gout-ridden Queen Anne of England arrived there at Carlston House to ask her physician, Dr. John Radcliffe, to travel to court immediately. The doctor flatly refused, and when the convoy tried to change his mind, he flung the man down the stairs, breaking his neck. Dr. Radcliffe died before he could be tried, and the house was bought by Sir John Fellows. Only a few years later, he had a heated argument with a tax collector on the first floor landing, and the revenue man plunged to his death after being knocked over by the balustrade. Afterwards, the ghosts of both victims were regularly seen there on the staircase. And then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here. So once again, this is the book The World's Greatest Ghosts by Roger Bohr, Chapter 6, Part 5, once again in the world of ghosts of royals and rulers. So let's talk about that here. I forgot how much this book just essentially is nonstop encounters. Almost every paragraph within every single page has encounters. Great stuff. So the first part was I was talking about the Duke of Newcastle, how essentially he was going to have a bunch of soldiers killed or ordered to be killed, like executed, when all of a sudden he stopped. Apparently, there was a female figure in white that appeared by his bed 3 times to tell him to basically stop, and so he ended up doing so. And then there was that British officer who was there on a trip, a holiday, if you will, there in a forest, and then he saw a legion of huge marching legion that basically went past him, and it was a reenaction of a fight between Romans and Germans 2,000 years earlier. Wow, how crazy is that? And then there's the other encounter involving more Civil War stuff, involving, like, for example, the Battle of Shiloh. 20,000 men had died there. So many men had died that the river ran red with blood. And then apparently to this day, you can hear sights and sounds of the battle, and it's apparently over the skies too. Like you can actually hear it over, if you look above, like you can hear the shots and so on happening. It's crazy stuff. And then there was more information associated with, in this case, World War I, how apparently the German trenches were fraught with battle, but also apparently with ghosts. These angels were known as phantom bowmen. Apparently, they had been there in a battle back in 1415, but then afterward, like what, 500 years later, they would now show up and then protect some of the people that were there, some of the soldiers, in other words, so much so that they were actually preventing the other force themselves to stay while the force that they were protecting were fleeing. Quite a sight. What kind of sight would that be today, right? Imagine something like that happening. There's so many wars happening in this world right now, so many major ones that anyone that sees these ghosts pop up. Imagine that happening, and now you have phones that could capture it all at once. What a sight that would be. So it makes you wonder if these particular angels, if these phantom bowmans or whoever are still showing up to this day, and maybe if soldiers are looking right at them. And then you have the information involving Abraham Lincoln, lots of sightings, lots of famous people that had seen him too. Sir Winston Churchill stating that he didn't like staying in Lincoln's old bedroom. Then there was the Queen Wilhelmina, who's said to have been fainted whenever she saw him appear over in the Rose Room. Then Theodore Roosevelt, famous president himself, who also apparently stated that he saw Lincoln shambling, homely, with a sad face, wandering throughout different rooms and halls. And then you have Franklin Roosevelt, the wife, I'm sorry, one of the staff of him, who saw Abraham Lincoln right there in one of the bedrooms pulling on a pair of boots. And then finally, you had some other encounters too associated with Lincoln, including a bodyguard of the president, Benjamin Harrison, who said he saw Lincoln so many times he finally had to tell him to please stop so that way he can concentrate on his job and protect the current president. So how interesting is that? And then finally, you had some of those mini examples that I was mentioning earlier. There was the one involving the ghost train of Lincoln, how after his coffin was there at several locations, stopped for 8 minutes, and then all of a sudden, people started to see a phantom train afterward that was also doing things, but with a skeletal crew. How crazy is that? Imagine seeing something along those lines. Not only you're seeing a phantom train, but it's being operated by skeletons. Creepy stuff. And then one that really stood out was apparently the King's Arms Inn. If you mock anything involving the idea of ghosts being there, then there'll be an immediate reaction. There will apparently be either a loud crash, like in the case of the heavy freezer being suddenly turned over, or things being thrown, like those steaks that were thrown across the room, or the sound of something else, like either heavy footsteps, heavy boots, or large flapping wings, all there while the air is turning cold. That's pretty creepy. And then finally, there was the one involving that staircase that it had 2 or 3 deaths right there at that location. It's apparently an area called the Carshalton House. If you're there at that house and you're there at that staircase, what a incredible but frightening spot to have a ghostly encounter, because now you have apparently 3 ghosts that haunt that specific spot because of their unnatural deaths. lots of stuff to share. So, and we're still maybe about 50 pages left when it comes to this book. So who knows how much I'll be sharing afterward. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.